Hello, my name's Alexander Iles and I'm looking forward to showing you some of Newcastle on the Great Minds Tour today as a part of Autism Acceptance Week. We're going to show you around certain sites of the city and tell you the stories of many of the great individuals whose ideas, minds and way of life have changed our city. So I'm really hoping that you'll be able to see something of Newcastle and learn something about these great people today. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go up near the Sage and I'll tell you a little bit more as we go on. So at the end of the last ice age, what you would have had here is a very different landscape to what you see today. The ice and snow that had covered all of the north of England and northern Scotland was now retreating, and as it retreated it left large U-shaped valleys like the Tyne Valley to suddenly be open for human navigation, and the human population started to migrate from continental Europe into Britain. Now back then Britain wasn't an island. Britain was actually a peninsula of the European continent, and so what you could do is you could walk across. So we know in the early days that the ancestors of the British people would actually walk across from Europe and from France and from Spain, and they'd walk across the European peninsula and they'd come to Britain during the summertime, and then in winter they'd go back down to the south of France, to northern Italy and to the Swiss Alps, and they would go backwards and forwards until rising water levels meant that Britain was cut off as an island. We actually know here in the northeast of England that we have evidence for the oldest continuous living house in the whole of the British Isles, and up in Howick, not far from Dunstanburgh, there's actually a wonderful recreation of this early house where people lived for 400 to 500 years, and they came every single summer, lived in this house, which is kind of looks like a bit of a teepee, and they would stay there for a number of seasons for 500 years. So when these people came to the northeast of England, they started to settle, and all along the Tyne Valley they started to settle here and live, and we start to find them in the evidence for them in the things that lasted the longest, and that's their monuments. So they actually built henges. Now the most famous henge in the country is down in the southwest, and that's Stonehenge, but a henge was originally where someone would dig a ditch around an area, normally in a circle or an oblong shape. When they dug that henge, they would then pile up the earth on the inside, creating a sacred space, or what we today would think of maybe something like a town hall, a church, or something where people would meet. And when people met in those locations, what they would do is they would start to upgrade them. And they took trees, and when they took trees, they would bury them with their branches going into the ground and the roots going into the sky. And these would create early monuments in the area where people would meet and gather. Following on from there, they then upgraded them to standing stones. And when they upgraded them to standing stones, obviously the most famous one is Stonehenge, which was the most complex one that we've seen yet. And they constantly upgraded it and rebuilt it over the course of its history. In fact, there's 4 henges down there. Up in the north of England, we've actually got a stone circle that's older than Stonehenge, and that's Montmeg and her daughters across near Penrith in Cumbria. So one of the things I'd definitely suggest is looking into that. When people did archaeology in this area just before building the Sage Gateshead, they actually discovered what could have been a henge on this location, but because of building that's happened here over the last 2,000 years, it was very hard to tell. But we think there was a religious site around here at the Sage, which would have been a henge of some form, and then across near the castle we know that there was another important spiritual site as well, which we'll come to in a little bit. So what we'll do now is we're going to head to the high level bridge, and I'll tell you a little bit more as we go on. So right here we're stood on the high level bridge, which is an amazing construction here in Newcastle and Gateshead, and it's actually a response to need, because originally if you were taking the train from Edinburgh to London, you actually had to stop in either Newcastle or Gateshead, get off, come down across what is now the swing bridge, but previously was the old Tyne Bridge, and then cross the other side, pick up the train and continue, which meant it would take you up to 3 days to travel between London and Edinburgh. So because of that, the Victorian industrialists said, no, we need to change this, and they created the high level bridge. And the high level bridge is an amazing piece of construction because it meant that suddenly you could travel between both capitals in a single day. And it was designed by the father and son team, George and Robert Stevenson. So what we'll do now is we're going to head across the other side of the bridge, and I'll tell you a little bit more there. So right here we're stood actually near the Castle Garth, so the castle is just behind you, and right here we have the high level bridge. So the high level bridge was actually designed by Robert Stevenson, who was the son of George Stephenson. He was actually one of the country's best bridge builders after Kingdom Brunel in his period, and he was very skilled in many different areas. But his family's story actually starts with his father, George. Now, George Stephenson was born along in Wylam, and his first job at the age of 8 was clearing stones from farmers' fields. So you can imagine, if you sent any kids out today to do that sort of work, next time they're complaining about homework, think about that. So he did that job, and then he joined his family in the coal mines. And when he joined his family in the coal mines, his father was a brakesman, which was the man responsible for ensuring that the mechanism for the lift in the coal mine didn't fail, and they kept pumping out water and also pumping down fresh air, because if you didn't have those, the coal mine was just unfeasible. So because of that, George Stephenson worked alongside his father, and when he was 17 years old, he took over his father's job as a brakesman. And when he took over his father's job, that meant he was suddenly given a higher pay, and he was able to get married at 17 years old and take himself to night school. And from the age of 17 to the age of 18, he taught himself how to read and write. So imagine that today. He was actually illiterate until he was 18 years old. Alongside this, when he was 18, he actually, as well, had his first child, Robert. And when he had his first child, Robert, this suddenly meant that his family had begun. His family continued to do relatively well until he was 25 years old. And when he was 25 years old, he suffered 2 tragedies. First of all, his 6-month-old daughter died of tuberculosis, and then 6 months after that, his wife died as well. And so because of that, he was struck by grief, and he went up to Scotland to become an engineer. When he was working in Scotland, he worked there for a while and left his son in the care of his sister and his father, but then he received a letter from his father telling him he'd just been blinded in a coal mining explosion. Because of that, he was then having to return back here to Newcastle, and he came here and he started innovating, and he created the George Stephenson mining lamp, which was the first mining lamp in the world to actually ensure that coal miners weren't blown up by underground gas. Unfortunately, he came to clashes with a southern engineer called Davies, and Davies was from down in Cornwall, and when he was down in Cornwall, he had actually invented his own mining lamp as well, but Stephenson had invented his first. Unfortunately, Davies has said, well, there's no way that this northern mechanic can invent his before me without a university education, and so because of that, George Stephenson didn't get the £3,000 reward for inventing his. He had to go to court and prove that he'd invented his mining lamp first, and he received £1,000 by subscription, which is around about £90,000 in today's money. Because of that, he was able to send Robert to a local school and give him the education at Dr. Bruce's Academy on Percy Street that he had never had. So that was a massive step forwards. Alongside this as well, George Stephenson was also working at the Killingworth coal mine when the engine at the Killingworth coal mine failed, and so because when it failed, he actually innovated the engine and made it work better than ever before without any form of education at that time, like formal education, I mean. And so because of that, he suddenly was able to show off the fact that he had innovated this steam engine and made it work far better than ever before. And he was employed by the Grand Alliance, which was the largest group of coal miners here in the northeast of England, and was paid £100 a year to become their chief engineer. From there, he was working a lot more on steam engines, and as Robert completed his education and went off to Edinburgh University to study chemistry, they worked together to create the rocket steam engine, with Robert being the lead engineer and his father George helping him in the background. So because of that, they worked together, and while George was inventing the railways as we know them today, which is the 4 foot 6 inches and a quarter gauge railway that is used all across the world, his son Robert invented the rocket, which was the first steam engine in the world to go at 29 miles an hour and 31 without a load. It won a major award, which meant that it became the basis for steam engines across the whole of the region and across the whole of the world. So it's very interesting to see how a father and son team coming from very humble backgrounds, just collecting stones from farmers' fields to become cobblestones, and without any formal education, went on to transform the world. So the Stephensons are amazing, and no matter where you go in the northeast of England, they'll be on people's lips. What we'll do now is we're going to move around the Castle Garth area, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the history here. So right here we're stood beside Newcastle's castle. So Newcastle's castle is just to the right of us right here, and on the floor you can actually look around and see cobblestones. These cobblestones here actually mark a Roman commanding officer's house that stood on the site where I'm standing right here, and this is because this was the fort of Ponus which was the first fort constructed on Hadrian's Wall, and Hadrian's Wall actually goes along Westgate Road just over here to the left of me. When the Romans came up to the north of Britain, they initially built a series of forts along a road called the Stern Gate, and these were the defensive forts, and some of them are very famous today, such as Vindolanda. But in AD 122, a massive Roman fleet sailed up the River Tyne and landed on the north bank of the river, down where the swing bridge is today on the quayside. They then came up here, and Emperor Hadrian and the 6th Legion disembarked, and we know this because we have found two shrines, one dedicated to Neptune and the other one dedicated to Oceanus, that were dredged out of the River Tyne during the Victorian period. What we know is that the fort right here was called Ponus Allius. Ponus is the Latin word for bridge, and Allius is Emperor Hadrian's family name. And we don't know much about the initial troops stationed here, but it was likely that the 6th Legion built the fort, and then from there we know in the 3rd Legion it was actually a German unit who was stationed here at Ponus Allius called the Cunganorum. And the first cohort of Cunganorum was stationed here alongside possibly a unit of Thracians or modern day Bulgarians later on in history, and then finally a unit of Britons from the Midlands that were stationed here in the late Roman period. When you think of the Romans, you probably think of little Italian guys wearing red tunics, shiny armour and marching in neat organised lines, but Hadrian's Wall was incredibly diverse. Starting in South Shields, the unit stationed there, well, we think there was a unit of Iraqis called the Tigris Bargemen, and also a unit of Frenchmen. Then as you go along the wall, you have Dutch and Belgians, Germans, Bulgarians, Greeks and Britons. Then as you go along the wall, you have Spanish, Greek, Belgian, Dutch, French, more Dutch, more Belgian, more Germans. Then you would have Iraqis, Syrians, Swiss, Dutch, Belgian, German, Romanians, Croatians, Syrians, and then finally North Africans and Dutch on the far end of the wall. These guys would have come here, they would have settled here for 25 years, they would have married local women, and then their sons would have joined the local regiments. So you've got a very diverse image of what Roman Britain would have looked like, and how these guys would have mixed with the local population and become the British as we understand ourselves today. After the Roman period, the Anglo-Saxons built a monastery on this site. So obviously the Anglo-Saxons were originally Germanic pagans, and they converted to Christianity here in the northeast of England because of the missionary efforts of people like Paulinus and St. Cuthbert and St. Aidan. And so because of that, they became Christians and they started building monasteries. We think there was a monastery on this site because when the Roman fort was here, it was a perfect location to have a local palace. And so there was a monastery, and it was succeeded for a number of years, but then slowly and steadily failed because of the success of other monasteries in the region, such as Monk Wearmouth down in Sunderland, Jarrow further along the River Tyne, and to the north obviously we have Lindisfarne. So this became almost like a conferencing venue for the Anglo-Saxon kings. And when it became a conferencing venue, that was incredibly important because the King of Northumbria could meet with his sub-kings, could meet with the Bishop of Durham, but also could meet with other kings around the region. So what we'll do now is we're going to pause and I'll show you the site where later on the Normans built a church in and around this area. So just behind me here I've got the Moot Hall, and underneath the Moot Hall here in Newcastle is likely the location where the first wooden castle was built. So obviously you'll probably have been told about 1066 when the Normans invaded Britain. Now the Normans invaded, they took over the country, and William the Conqueror got crowned in December of 1066. But when he got crowned, what they don't tell you is what happened in the next few years. In 1067, Devon and Cornwall revolted and the Normans had to put down that revolt. 1068, the Danes invaded Yorkshire and they burnt down York, were paid money by William the Conqueror and then went home. And then 1069, the northeast of England revolted. a large force of Normans went up to Durham, and when they went to Durham they were ambushed and brutally murdered. And then up here in the northeast of England, what happened was that William the Conqueror put in a new Prince Bishop to control the region. He gave the huge amount of land of Northumbria to a man called Bishop Walcher. Now Walcher was working well with the locals, but came into arguments with a local by the name of Linulf. And Linulf was a very interesting man. He was descended in part from the kings of Northumbria and had royal blood in him. And he wanted to try and actually create peace in the region. But Walcher had a number of Norman knights who were going around the place, causing a lot of friction with the Anglo-Saxons. They were confiscating their property, they were killing their livestock, they were killing their families. And so because of this, Linulf and Walcher came to loggerheads and eventually had a large row. And Linulf said, "I'm not going to work with you anymore." And he actually just distanced himself from Walcher. When he did this, he went further along the River Tyne to Newburn, where he had a family palace. And when he went there, what happened was that Walcher's knights took offence. They went along the River Tyne, waited till midnight, nailed the doors of his house shut and burnt him and his family to death. This caused for a big incident here in the region, and they had a peace conference across in the Church of St Mary, where Gateshead's Heritage Centre is today. And when they had that conference there, they said, all right, we need to sort of organise a peace. And for the Anglo-Saxons, the relations of Linulf stood up to Walcher and said, "We want you to hand over your knights to face justice." And Walcher just turned around and said, "No, that's not happening. They're Normans, they're a part of my retinue, even some of them were distantly related to him." And so because of this, they said, "We're not doing that," and the Anglo-Saxons stormed out of the church. Walcher and his knights sat down inside the church. There were 100 Norman knights in Walcher. They were eating, they were drinking, and they were laughing at the Anglo-Saxons, when all of a sudden they smelt fire. And when they smelt fire, they fled outside, and there was an ambush, and they all got brutally murdered. When they got brutally murdered, William the Conqueror lost his temper, and he issued a decree called the Harrying of the North. And this is the first recorded English genocide. They killed 100,000 people in the north of England. And to give you an idea, the population was estimated to be about 400,000, so 1 in every 4 people in the north. England's population at this time is estimated to be 1 million. So if you imagine 1 in every 10 people in England and 1 in every 4 in the north were killed during this harrowing, where basically they went from village to village slaughtering people. It wasn't at all engineered or planned in any way, but what they did is they just started killing people, and they killed all the livestock they could get their hands on as well. And so people were forced into the wilderness, and we have reported incidences of cannibalism as well. Parents had to tie their children onto their belts with pieces of string, because otherwise there was a good chance that if your child walked away, you might not see them again. So this was a horrendous time, and it lasted from 1070 till 1080. And then William the Conqueror told his son, Robert Curthose, to go to the north bank of the River Tyne and build him his new castle. So because of that, there was a wooden castle built on this site. That wooden castle lasted a while until it burned down. Someone thinks, well, generally historians think that it was a fire that was left unattended. And when it burned down, they rebuilt the castle in stone under the reign of King Henry II from 1167 to 1177. So if you look right here, you can see the later on Plantagenet Castle of Newcastle. This is the monument that has given the city its name. The castle was the main defensive position for a number of years and was actually really important during the Anglo-Scottish Wars, because William Wallace actually assaulted Newcastle twice but was unable to breach its walls. So he went along to Hexham and Corbridge, caused widespread devastation and murder and pillaging right there in Tyne Valley before he went down through County Durham and Yorkshire and then fled to France. When he fled to France, Edward I was not going to let him get away, and so because of that sent 3 of his knights across to kidnap this butcher. When they kidnapped him, they then brought him back across to London and they hung, drew and quartered him, which was a horrendous medieval punishment where you'd be hung until you were nearly dead, cut from neck to belly button, your insides would be burnt in front of you, and then finally your heart would be pulled out, and you were probably alive for about 11 seconds before finally you died. Then his body was quartered, his head was beheaded and put on London Bridge, and it was then spread around the rest of the country. Newcastle received his right arm, which was put on the medieval Tyne Bridge as a tourist information sign to say, "Don't mess with the king." So Newcastle's castle was an important location where the people of Newcastle could actually come and find safety during this amazingly difficult time between the wars between England and Scotland. And so I absolutely love telling that one. Alongside this, Robert the Bruce's sister spent a number of years here because she was kept prisoner inside the castle during this period. So I hope you've enjoyed those stories, and what we'll do now is we'll continue on to our next story, and I'll tell you a little bit more as we go on. So right here we have the Black Gate, which is the gatehouse of Newcastle's castle. This was built by King Henry III to refortify this area around Newcastle and to actually provide better defences at the front of the castle itself. It's known as the Black Gate because of one of the people who owned it in the past, Mr. Patrick Black. Now the story goes is that a gentleman from Newcastle actually borrowed money from Mr. Patrick Black, who was King Charles II's tailor. When he borrowed the money, what happened was that the man bought a number of pubs and also the Black Gate right here in Newcastle, but then defaulted on his loan. He was unable to pay it back. So suddenly Mr. Patrick Black's sitting down in London and receives a letter telling him he's now the proud owner of the gatehouse of Newcastle's castle. So what he does is he rents it out, and his name is on all the paperwork, and when he passes away his wife takes over and continues. So because of that it was known as Black's Gate, and then eventually became known as the Black Gate as it is today. So there's a bit of a history of the story of this site. And so when you think of the Black Gate, it's not black or evil deeds, it's actually Mr. Patrick Black who is the owner of this site. What we'll do now is we'll move on, and I'll tell you a little bit more as we go on our tour. So right here we're stood outside the front of St. Nicholas's Cathedral Church, and St. Nicholas's, originally we know that there was a church on this site since the 1100s, and we think the original church probably wasn't actually called St. Nicholas's. It was probably had a different name, or maybe was just referred to as the church on this site, or Newcastle's church. But by the end of the 12th century we know that it's definitely referred to as St. Nicholas's, because St. Nicholas was a very popular saint in the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries. He was the patron saint of merchants, sailors, fishermen, repentant thieves, schoolchildren and doctors, which was one of the largest portfolios of any medieval saints. So because of that, it really developed as a location for the merchants of Newcastle. And you can even see that in the construction of the church right here, because by the 15th century, what you actually start seeing is wealthy Newcastle merchants such as Robert Rhodes and Roger Thornton start dedicating to the church. And so you get these large donations of things like lead from the roof from Roger Thornton, but on top of that, Robert Rhodes actually pays for the lantern tower on the top of the church. And the lantern tower is a very, very interesting piece of construction. What you see is that the four arches come to the center, and there's a large rectangular box in the center. That there is a lighthouse. During the Middle Ages, it was someone's job to climb up there and fill it with wood and coal, so throughout the day and the night that it would always be burning, and ships outside of Newcastle could guide their way in and see that light from there. And so that was the way that the local faith and the local business came together for the benefit of Newcastle, so that there was always a fire in there, and it acted like a lighthouse, so that ships out to sea could come into Newcastle and guide their way in, following the light of St. Nicholas's, so that they could come and trade in the city. And so that actually really helped to provide wealth and money for the city centre of Newcastle, combining together the merchants of Newcastle with also the local faith in the city centre. If you look down here as well, we've also got a statue dedicated to Queen Victoria. Now, if you look at it, it's very much the stereotypical image that we have of the Imperial Queen. She's shown at the later end of her life. She's very serious and austere. And throughout the whole of Britain during Victoria's reign, after the death of Albert, she actually ordered that all of the statues of her had to be painted black to reflect her mourning. And so because of that, you can see this right here in Newcastle. Now, Queen Victoria only visited Newcastle 3 times during her reign. The first time was to open Newcastle Central Station. The second time she stopped her train in the middle of the high-level bridge during a large fire down on the quayside and pledged £10,000 of her own money to the redevelopment of the quayside. But the final time she came here to Newcastle, she actually stayed at the Royal Station Hotel. Now, when she stayed at the Royal Station Hotel, the story goes is that the manager of the hotel asked her to pay for her dinner. Now, one of the things you do is you never ever ask the Imperial Queen of the British Empire to pay for her dinner, and she took great offence at this. And when she took great offence at this, she said that she never again wanted to look upon Newcastle. And because she never again looked upon the city, Newcastle had quite a difficult relationship with her. In fact, when she died, she actually said that every institution in the country named after her should receive an item of her clothing. And here in Newcastle, the Royal Victoria Infirmary actually received 2 pairs of her underwear, which we don't know was a final parting, well, sort of like towards Newcastle and winding them up. So there's an interesting one for you right there. So another reason why Queen Victoria may have had a problem with Newcastle was because of its Member of Parliament, Joseph Cowen. Now, Joseph Cowen's family were actually quite radical. His grandfather was a blacksmith up in Bamborough and had actually provided sick pay and support pay to his members of staff and to his workers up in Bamborough. Cowen's father himself had actually set up a brick factory across in Blaydon upon Tyne, and that actually gave the family quite a bit of money, and then young Joseph was sent to Edinburgh University. Now, when he was studying at Edinburgh University, he had quite a radical education, because instead of going to his lectures and maybe partying like modern university students, he spent a lot of his money actually supporting strikers and spending time with radicals throughout the whole of Europe. And he left university without completing his degree, came back here and started supporting people in their campaign for better pay, better support, better living standards, and really trying to improve what they were doing throughout the whole of the northeast with the heavy industries in the area, which didn't necessarily always provide the best stability, best pay, and also the best living standards for their workers. So Cowen really worked in that area. When he was working in and amongst that area, eventually his father passed away and he inherited the brick factory that he had across in Blaydon, and he set up the Blaydon Institute. Now, the Blaydon Institute was a massive thing here in the northeast because it had a free school attached to it. And what he did was he invited all of his revolutionary friends from all over Europe for whenever they got kicked out of their home countries to actually come and become lecturers and teachers at the Blaydon Institute. This meant that people got a very radical education, but it was entirely free, and the people of Tyneside would go there and get all the benefit from the Blaydon Institute. Following on from this, he was also a Member of Parliament for Newcastle, and he would get up regularly in Parliament and speak about how empires were evil. He hated empires. He hated the Russian Empire, he hated the Ottoman Empire, he hated all of the different empires in the world, and he said how Britain needed to get rid of its empire, needed to become a republic, and would speak regularly about this in Parliament. And there's a good chance that Queen Victoria didn't like the fact that this guy was basically saying that we needed to get rid of her job. So he was regularly doing this every single day in Newcastle and down in Parliament, and was an incredibly radical man. We think he was involved in an assassination attempt against Napoleon III, and on top of this as well, there's a good chance he may have been also involved in an assassination attempt on Victoria's life herself. So a very radical guy. Near the end of Cowen's life though, he became quite disillusioned with politics, and unfortunately he was doing a rally where his stage collapsed. His supporters rushed forwards to try and help him, and when they rushed forwards to try and help him, he got crushed and unfortunately developed health issues that eventually led to his death. Cowen's an amazing politician and has an amazing foundation here in Tyneside, and is one of those minds who just looked at the time and said, no, I'm not happy with the way things are and I want to change them for the better. So please look more into his story, and what we'll do now is we'll continue on and I'll tell you another story as we go. So this here is the big market, and it'll be familiar to many of you who are watching. So the big market originally started as one of the medieval markets of Newcastle. To the north of St Nicholas's, Newcastle grew up from the 12th century onwards and grew out to the surrounding area you see today. So big itself doesn't actually mean large. Big is a Swedish and Scandinavian word meaning barley, and this is where the barley market was here in Newcastle, because every family would produce their own home-brewed beer. Beer was very important in the past because it supplemented your diet by providing a high-energy, high-calorie drink that you could eat and drink throughout the day. It wasn't as strong as modern-day beer, because when I say beer today, you're probably thinking between 4 and 5% alcohol, which is quite standard for most beers today. But back then it was between 1 and 2% and was actually beneficial as well because it was alcoholic. It would kill germs, clean the water, and also the fermenting process would provide extra energy for food and drink for people in their day-to-day lives. The streets coming off the big market as well also tell their own stories. For instance, you've got the cloth market right down here. Cloth market is where you'd buy and sell your clothing. Then also you've got the groat market. Groat is a Northumbrian word that means wheat or flour, and that's actually where you would get your bread. And later on, in the 1880s, that's actually where Bero's self-raising flour was invented. And so you've got the history of baking down there as well. One of the streets coming off here is Pudding Chair, and pudding isn't anything to do with the modern way we say pudding, which is to do with sweets and things like that, but instead is to do with the way that we now think of stuff like black pudding. So across in France, Germany, other continental countries, they have a lot more history of sausages and things like that. And so they would actually, on the big market, just off there, have the Pudding Chair, where you would provide the links of sausages required for daily life back then, and the smoked and dried meats. So while we're standing here in the big market, I'll actually tell you a little bit about the Newcastle eccentrics. Now, when we say the word eccentric today, you probably think of someone maybe like a mad scientist or an inventor, or you get images of like various different characters from films. But in the past, eccentric meant something different. It has a meaning in modern English along the lines of pitiable, or someone who you would actually have great compassion towards. And the Newcastle eccentrics were in the late 18th and early 19th century, a group of people in Newcastle who suffered from some forms of poverty, but also alongside this as well, were generally what we would call neurodiverse today, and they were very interesting characters. For instance, starting off, I'll talk about Bold Archie. Bold Archie was a massive, strong man who lived here in Newcastle, hugely muscular, and was a large man in society. He was taller than everyone else around him, and he was a very peaceable and quiet guy. He lived with his mother, and she was between 4 and 5 foot tall, quite a small woman. But because of Bold Archie's incredible size, people would always try and go up to him and try and start fights with him. When they tried to start fights with him, they wanted to show how tough they were to fight this huge giant of a man. But every single time they tried to wind him up, his mum would come over, speak a few quiet words to him and take him away, and he would immediately follow her away. After his mother passed away, he actually picked up a girlfriend, and they lived down on the quayside, and she had the same effect on him. And he was always known for being a kind and gentle man and using his huge strength to help other people around him. He actually died in his late 70s in Newcastle. The next character is Captain Benjamin Starkey. Captain Benjamin Starkey is a really interesting character as well. We don't actually know where he got the title captain, and he himself, when he was asked, he would never remember himself as well. But he would walk around Newcastle in a pseudo military dress, and he'd go up to people, and he had an incredible way of begging. What he would do is he'd always go up to people and say, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, I've actually just run out of funds this month. Would I be able to write you an IOU, and you'd be able to lend me some money until the next time pay comes through, and then I'll need to survive on to then, and then I'll be able to pay you back in no time, I'll be able to pay you back." And he was always very eccentric, and people would come up to him and they would be happily give him the begging money he was asking for. And then he had the most beautiful handwriting, so he'd write these amazing IOUs that he'd hand over to people and say, "Here's your IOU, go, I'll pay you back in the future, I'll pay you back in the future." And he always claimed to be close friends with the highest ranking members of society, and he would say things like, "Oh, I know the Surtees family," or "I know the Branding family of Jesmond." And when he said this, he would always capture people's attention, and they absolutely loved him because they knew he was a beggar, but at the same time they loved the way he did his begging. Next, you had Cuddy Billy. Cuddy Billy would walk around Newcastle, and he walked around in tattered clothing, and he would play his fiddle to people. But his fiddle was actually a piece of wood, a plank of wood with a couple of pieces of twine on it. And he would go around the pubs of Newcastle, and he would pretend to play the most famous songs that were going at this time. And he could always remember the songs, but he only had this tiny piece of wood which had nailed onto it the pieces of string that was his fiddle. Unfortunately, he was terribly addicted to alcohol, and he couldn't, once he started drinking, stop drinking. So one day he was walking through the big market here when a number of men thought it was hilarious to just give him bottle after bottle of brandy. And after a number of bottles of brandy, he dropped dead, and they were then later on charged for his murder. Silly Billy was another character in Newcastle, and he was a really interesting character who is one of the clearest ones to show neurodiversity. He had a near-on photographic memory, and what he would do is he'd memorize all of the psalms, the popular songs of the time, poems, things like that, and he'd walk around Newcastle and he'd be able to recite them, and this is how he begged and got his income. So he would recite these poems to people and things like that. One day he was in the big market, and a rich, wealthy gentleman in Newcastle walked past him, and when this rich, wealthy gentleman walked past him, he said, "Get out of my way, I don't give space for fools." And then Silly Billy just turned around and said, "But I do," and stepped aside to let the man walk past. immediately making a fool of him because the man had been so rude to him in turn, but Silly Billy had just turned around and just turned it back on him. And so he's an amazing character as well. Finally, one of my favorite neurodiverse characters is Tommy on the bridge. Tommy was quite unfortunate. He had actually had blindness and he wasn't able to see, but he had good sense of touch. And what he would do is he would beg on a swing bridge. And when he sat on the swing bridge in the Victorian period in Newcastle, you could get 20 to 30,000 people a day crossing the swing bridge. So he'd beg there and he could feel the coins that you gave him in his hand, and he knew by their weight and their touch which coin you'd given to him. So he'd beg on the bridge, but the swing bridge was turning 50 times a day during the Victorian period, and Tommy on the bridge would always get so annoyed at the bridge turning to allow ships to go past, and he would swear and curse and yell at all of the ships as they forced the bridge to turn and caused him to have a loss of income. Eventually he saved up enough of his begging money that he was able to take it to a law firm in Newcastle, and he tried to take the Porter Tyne to court for loss of earnings. So he's one of my favourite characters as well when you talk about these amazing Newcastle eccentrics who lived during the 18th and 19th century here in Newcastle. So right here we're standing beside this fantastic Rutherford fountain, and it's actually remembering a really important character in Newcastle, John Hunter Rutherford. John Hunter Rutherford was from Jedburgh, and he came down to Newcastle and set up a free church chapel just down on Neville Street, opposite where Central Station is today. When he set up his chapel, it grew so rapidly that suddenly they needed to extend the number of worshippers. So they moved on to Bath Lane, and they actually started a small church on Bath Lane, which eventually grew to the point where it had a very, very large congregation. John Hunter Rutherford really believed in education, and he was concerned at the fact that many children in Newcastle at this time didn't have access to education. And so what he did is he said to local families, if you bring your children to Sunday school, we'll provide a free breakfast to the kids. So because of that, parents brought their children there, because then it was one less meal they had to feed the kids, but the kids learnt how to read and write in Newcastle. John Hunter Rutherford then realised that there was actually a gap in education. The wealthier in society could actually afford to have tutors, and when they could afford to have tutors, this meant that then they could tutor their children and then they could go on to colleges and university. Normal people couldn't afford that. So he said he came up with a principle called the pyramid of education, where there would be primary, secondary and tertiary education, and depending on your skill you could advance to the next level. So they created Rutherford School, and Rutherford School meant that children from the age of 12 to 14 could get that next level of education and then could then go on to colleges and continue their education there. His Rutherford School was so successful that he then extended it and created Rutherford College, which then focused on the arts, the sciences, had labs, it had taught people engineering, it taught people physics, geology, and all of the other arts at that time, so that students who had the ability could move on from the school to the college and then get that third level of education. They continued on, but John Hunter Rutherford himself was really working very hard here in Newcastle. Not only was he a preacher and a church leader, but he was also a medical doctor, and he was providing medical care to people in Newcastle. And then finally, on top of that as well, he was also providing education to the kids. So he died in his 60s, unfortunately, and when he passed away, the colleges and schools that he provided here in Newcastle then continued, and today you'll know them by different names. So there is actually a school in the West End of Newcastle called Rutherford School that exists, but his Rutherford School actually became Newcastle Sixth Form College. And then finally, Rutherford College actually transformed in its own way and actually became Northumbria University as you see it today. And so because of one man providing a basic breakfast for children in Newcastle, 60,000 students a year receive an education because of one man's vision to create an education from one step to the next step to the next step. So that because of your ability and not of your wealth, you could access the next level of education. So he's one of the great heroes here. He was also a great believer in social care as well, and he created this fountain alongside Joseph Cowan so that people could access water in Newcastle. And one of the things about this fountain that I absolutely love is you can see just written on it, just behind me here, water is best, to encourage people to get off alcohol and instead to focus on drinking water to provide a healthier society. So there's a brilliant story about one of Newcastle's heroes who you've probably heard almost nothing about during your time living here. So what I'll do now is I'll take you on to the next step and we'll continue with our next story there. So you've probably all seen the Newcastle Chronicle, but there's an amazing story behind its early foundation and some of the early people who were involved in it. So we have to go right the way back to the 18th century, and in Cumbria there was a woman called Anne Fisher. Now Anne Fisher was one of 6 daughters for a Cumbrian parish priest, and he wanted to invest into his daughters, so he gave them the education of a young gentleman at this time. Anne Fisher was fascinated with education, so she decided to write a book called A New Grammar, a most easy guide to speaking and writing the English language properly and correctly. Definitely not an easy title to remember. So what she did next was she moved to Newcastle and she married Thomas Slack, who was the owner of the Newcastle Chronicle. When Thomas passed away, her daughter Sarah married the chief journalist of the newspaper, Solomon Hodgson. And Solomon Hodgson absolutely loved going around Newcastle, finding the stories and reporting on them. And the Chronicle at this time was a really interesting newspaper because it was a free newspaper. Now this doesn't mean it didn't cost you anything to buy, it just meant it had no political association. So it meant they reported the news freely and easily to all of these people living in the city. Now he went around getting the stories, but it was his wife Sarah who was the chief editor. She then decided how it would look in the paper and ran the whole paper herself. And they had 3 children. When they had 3 children, the interesting thing is that sadly one of their sons actually died when he was a young man in his late teens at 17 years old. But her other son didn't go into journalism, and it was her daughter instead who joined with her when Solomon Hodgson unfortunately passed away due to exposure when he was going around gathering stories in Newcastle in a storm. And when he had passed away, it was her and her daughter who ran the newspaper together. When Sarah herself though passed away, her daughter didn't want to run the newspaper on her own, and she was approached by Joseph Cohen, our friend from earlier. And when she was approached by Joseph Cohen, Cohen then took over the newspaper and turned it into a much more radical publication than it was underneath Thomas Slack, Sarah Hodgson and Solomon Hodgson. And so what we're going to do now is move on to another great mind, and right here we have Earl Grey. Now I'm going to guess the most you've ever heard about Earl Grey is a cup of tea, but what you won't know is that he was actually Prime Minister of this country from 1830 to 1834. Aged 66 years old, he was called out of political semi-retirement to lead the Whig Party, the radical party in British politics at this time. And during his government, Britain was now coming out of a long period of conflict and a long period of where the country had been ruled a lot by traditionalists, and the Duke of Wellington had just been voted out of power, and now the Liberal Party, or the Whigs as they were called, were voted in under Earl Grey. Earl Grey passed 2 massive reforms in the country. The first is the Great Reform Act, which increased the number of voters in this country from 200,000 to 707,000, which is really quite amazing, but it's definitely not democracy as you'd understand it today. It was every man over the age of 25 who had more than £10 worth of property, which to put into modern money is like owning a house worth £150,000 outright with no mortgage. So you can understand, again, the number of voters, if we had those same rules today, would be dramatically less in the country. The second thing he did was the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. Now before then, there were a load of people who were bought and sold as casually as we drink tea and coffee today. It was seen as normal to have slaves, and it's a terrible part of history and a terrible part of our history as a country. But Earl Grey's political hero was a guy called Charles James Fox, and in 1828 he'd actually managed to pass a law that no slaves were allowed to be sold through a British port. And Earl Grey then built upon this, and in 1832 they abolished the slave trade in the British Empire. Now they tried to put it through Parliament a couple of times before, but people had so much money tied up in slaves that they didn't want to get rid of the slave trade, and this was a massive thing back then. So because of that, it failed first 2 times, but the 3rd time they were preparing, and the famous abolitionist William Wilberforce had actually been Earl Grey's mentor when he was growing up, and just shortly before the vote, William Wilberforce passed away. When Wilberforce passed away, all the members of Parliament started getting cold feet. They're like, should we pass this? Should we not pass this? Are we going to let this go through? And Earl Grey had to become very pragmatic. And what he did was he set a price for every single slave in the British Empire, and the government did a mass purchase. At the cost of £10 million in old money, every single slave was purchased. and then reimbursed to the slave owners. Now, to put this in a modern context, that is £47 billion, 590 million. So that just shows you how many slaves were reimbursed. So how many slaves were purchased by the government, then released, and their owners reimbursed. And it was a massive thing because we only finished paying off the slave debt in 2015. So Earl Grey is one of the most important characters, not only for our democracy, but alongside that as well for how we understand human beings ourselves and human rights. So I really think it's important that more people know about him and what his government managed to do. This street behind me is Mosley Street, and Mosley Street is actually the first street in the entire world to be lit by electric light. The reason why is because of a man called Sir Joseph Wilson Swan. Now, Swan was born in Sunderland, and his father was a failed businessman, so he apprenticed his son to a druggist, or what we today would call a pharmacist. When he was working in Sunderland, Sunderland at this time had horrendous health issues, and so because of that, his masters both died in a cholera epidemic. So because of that, he moved here to Newcastle, and his new master was a guy called Mawson's. Mawson's was a very indulgent master, and what he allowed him to do was he allowed Swan to spend a lot of time researching, and because of that, Swan invented the technology that meant, or the fluid, that meant that photographs did not fade when they were exposed to light. From there, Swan knew there was a way to invent the electric light bulb, and he tried to innovate this over years, but he had to wait for other things to be invented first. The things he had to wait for was an improved filament, a vacuum pump to allow for the glass bulbs to have a vacuum inside of them, and also a better electrical generator so that they could produce enough electricity to produce electric light. But eventually, after tons and tons of innovation, in 1878, he demonstrated his first ever electric light bulb to a crowd of 700 people in the Literary and Philosophical Society here in Newcastle. And the next year in February, he demonstrated it to 900 people again, proving that the electric light bulb must have worked. Now, this must have been something absolutely magical at the time to be in that room, because suddenly the gas lights would have been turned down, and at a flick of a switch, you would have watched this glass bulb suddenly light up as the filament suddenly becomes more and more bright, and then light comes out of it. It would have been seen as a massive jump forwards in technology and improvement of the way the world worked. From there, Joseph Wilson Swan was actually brought on board by Lord Armstrong, a famous industrialist in the city who I'm going to talk about slightly later. And Armstrong had his house, Cragside in Northumberland, lit by electric light. And from there, Swan started to produce the light bulb here in Newcastle. Unfortunately, across in America, Edison, the American industrialist, came up with a strikingly similar design. And when he came up with a strikingly similar design, he took Swan to court. When he took Swan to court, there was a long legal battle until eventually they were forced to go into partnership. And when they went into partnership, Swan got 60% of the company and Edison got 40%, and they rebranded it as Ediswan. But it meant they had to move the light bulb factory from South Benwell down to London, which was unfortunate because the industry was taken out of the region. From there, the light bulb has become something so common that we see in our houses every single day, and yet we don't even think about it. But it's all down to the innovations of men like Swan, who came up with the concept of providing electric light in our homes. So right here we're stood at the swing bridge, and the swing bridge is an amazing part of Newcastle's history. The reason it's here is because of the industry that was going on at the time during the 19th century. What I'll do first though is give some background to it. So the character who's responsible in many ways for the swing bridge is a guy called Lord Armstrong. William Armstrong Sr. walked from Carlisle and Cumbria across to Newcastle to get a job here. And when he walked here, he settled in Shieldfields and he became a corn merchant in the city. When he became a corn merchant in the city, he was very prosperous and eventually became mayor of Newcastle, and his son, William Armstrong Jr., grew up here. Now, from a young age, William Armstrong Sr. had been interested in mathematics, and he had the largest mathematical textbook collection outside of London. So William Armstrong Jr. grew up reading these maths books, and his mother jokingly said that he had water on the brain, or he was fascinated with the properties of water. So because of that, he was a really interested young man in the sciences, and when he went to school, he went to Bishop Auckland Private School. He was educated there, and when all the young boys were skiving off school to go to local pub, instead he skived off to go to local factories. He met the local factory owner's daughter, and when he finished school he actually married her, and they actually had a long loving relationship together. Now he turned to his father when he was 18 years old and said, "I want to become an engineer." And his father turned around and said, "No you don't, you're going to become a lawyer." And so from a very young age he had to go and study at law school, but in his spare time he was always looking at engineering, mathematics and other things like that. He became a fellow of the Royal Society, and even in 1840 Lord Armstrong, as he was going to become later on, actually said that 1 acre of land in the tropics would produce enough energy to power a city. And he was really fascinated about hydroelectricity, solar electricity and other ways of producing electricity, because he said that coal was inefficient, smelly and not very good as a power source. So because of that, he practiced law for a number of years until he was about 40 years old, and then he actually decided, and he turned to his father, he turned to his godfather, Armour Donkin, whose law firm he had been a part of, and he said, "I want to actually go into engineering now." And so because of that, he actually started a craneage firm. And when he started a craneage firm, he started producing cranes here in Newcastle, and he invented the pneumatic crane. When he produced the pneumatic crane, this was a world first. It was suddenly the first crane that was able to lift weights previously thought impossible for a crane, because he used the principle of pneumatics, used pressurized oil and pressurized water to lift weights previously thought impossible. And so because of that, he demonstrated it down here on the quayside and started producing them, buying 4.5 acres of land off a man called Mr. Granger here in Newcastle, and then started producing this large factory where he was producing the pneumatic crane here in Newcastle. For a number of years he did this until the Crimean War started, and when the Crimean War started, Armstrong saw how British troops were being massacred because we had ineffectual artillery, and the British artillery was too heavy, wasn't accurate and was getting caught in the mud in Crimea, and so because of that it wasn't able to support British troops. He invented the Armstrong gun, which was more advanced than any other artillery piece on the market, had greater range, was lighter, and for the first time had a rifled barrel, and he created the bullet-shaped artillery shell, which was loaded into the gun through the breech or the rear of the gun for the first time ever. When he produced the Armstrong gun, this was a massive step forwards, because suddenly the British Army had a weapon that was more advanced than any other artillery piece on the market. And he gave the patent to the British government, which meant that he was made Lord Armstrong, Baron of Jesmond, and was given this huge amount of land, which we today call Jesmond Dean. When he was given this land, it was a massive step forwards for him, because he was able to test his guns and constantly improve them, but at the same time he was given £1 million back pay. And when they gave the patent to the British government, originally it was produced down in the Woolwich Arsenal, and this is why today the football team Arsenal, they have an artillery piece on their badge. It's because it's William Armstrong's gun that was produced down there that went onto the football team's badge on their strip. But the Woolwich Arsenal wasn't able to produce enough artillery pieces, so William Armstrong produced a second artillery company up here on the River Tyne down in Elsick, which he had no financial connections to, and produced more artillery guns, and eventually it produced 3,000 guns for the British Army. After about 4 years, the British government was then petitioned by British generals who were very conservative, and they said, no, old guns are best guns. They broke contract with Armstrong, and Armstrong was allowed to sell his guns to the entire world. He's famous for selling them to most European nations, all of North America, all of South America, Russia, China and Japan. And he then went on to partner with shipbuilding companies and produced warships on the River Tyne. He went on to produce guns for the entire world until eventually the British government wanted to get Armstrong back on side, because they realised that his artillery was more and more advanced, and they had actually allowed themselves to fall behind in the arms race of that period. Armstrong, though, went on to produce his house Cragside, which was the first house in the entire world to be lit by electric light, to be powered by hydroelectricity, which was because they diverted 2 rivers underneath the property to generate the electricity to power the house. And then finally, alongside that as well, had the world's first ever dishwasher and lift inside it as well. So he was really much getting what we'd consider the mod cons in a house back in the 19th century. Armstrong built the swing bridge down here, which is a hydroelectric bridge, so that ships could go up and down the River Tyne, because previously the ships that could only get as far as the medieval and the older 17th and 18th century bridge on this site, because of the fact they stopped communication further upriver. And so Armstrong, as a part of the river development team, actually came up with the idea of the swing bridge. And the swing bridge is powered by 2 chambers that are flooded with water. The water pressurizes through the chambers, generating hydroelectricity that turns the bridge 360 degrees. During the Victorian time, it turned 50 times a day, and as we told earlier with Tommy on the bridge, much to his frustration, because it stopped people crossing the bridge and generating him an income. But because of that, ships were able to go up and down the river, get access to the large coal supplies across in Dunstan and in Gateshead, and alongside this as well, access Armstrong shipyards down in Elsick, which became one of the major factories for the entire world, with the Russian fleet, the Japanese fleet, and many other world powers fleets such as Brazil being built down there and then being taken to the entire world. So he's an amazing character, and unfortunately in Newcastle today, Armstrong isn't really talked about because of his connections to the arms trade, but I definitely suggest you read up about him, because he's one of these amazing characters who transformed the world in many ways that we see today, with his inventions in hydraulics enabling for lifts today in people's buildings. He had the dishwasher, obviously, which is now something that we see so commonly today. He had electric lighting in his house Cragside and popularized it for the entire world. And alongside that as well, his prophecies in 1840 that within 200 years Britain would cease to produce electricity using coal and rely entirely on renewable energies. Well, we've got 20 years left to prove him right. So I really hope that's the case, and I'd say go and look at Armstrong, because he's an amazing character. So what we'll do now is we'll head down the quayside, and I'll tell you a little bit more as we go on. I'm down here on the quayside to talk to you about the Tyneside rowers. Now, the Tyneside rowers worked down here on the quayside, and Harry Clasper started rowing at the age of 30, when most Olympians today are actually considering retirement. So he started down here on the riverside, and he was originally a coal miner. And him alongside his four brothers, 1 brother-in-law and 3 actual brothers, started rowing down here, and they competed on the River Tyne at a time when sportsmen weren't actually paid for being sportsmen. The way you'd make your money is actually by winning prizes. So he competed on the River Tyne and on the River Thames, and they competed initially against the London team, and they lost by 1 length. And he knew it wasn't because of the skill of him and his brothers, but instead because of the design of their boat. So he took it home and he re-innovated the way the boat worked. They put a flat bottom on it, and he changed the oar and created the Newcastle oar, which is still used in rowing today on the Cambridge and Oxford boat race. Because of that, he won, and they actually beat the London team by 2 or 3 lengths. And so because of that, they went on to win the World Championship, and he competed for a number of years. And he became a local hero down in the sporting area down here on the Tyne. When he finally passed away, he had actually raised enough money to buy a local pub, and that's what he used as his retirement fund, because the pub actually paid for him to live a comfortable life. And when he died, 130,000 people lined the banks of the River Tyne to watch his coffin go the route of the Tyne race one last time. Robert Chambers was his protege. He started rowing when they were actually demolishing the old Tyne Bridge to actually start building the swing bridge in its place. And when he rowed down here on the riverside, he actually was rowing up and down here and won the World Championship 5 times, both as a sculler and as a part of a team of 4. So he was a really, really important Tyneside rower. Finally, the last Tyneside rower was James Renford. Now, he and his team had actually won on the St. Lawrence River in Canada, and they had become world champions. But the next year he went back to compete again, and when he was rowing on the river, he unfortunately had an attack on his health. We don't know if it was a seizure, or if it was a heart attack or something like that, but what happened was that he collapsed into the arms of his fellow rowers and he passed away. And you can actually see a monument to him outside the front of Gateshead Library, even to this day. So the Tyneside rowers are absolutely amazing. And can you imagine between 50 to 100,000 people turning up to watch a race down here on the riverside, and how amazing it would have been to watch these rowers racing up and down here. It would have been a huge event and even more popular than the football is today. And even looking at Harry Clasper, 130,000 people came out to watch his funeral. How many modern day celebrities could you say could get a number of 130,000 people to come out and watch? And even modern day footballers, I doubt that when some of them die, as many people will turn out to watch their funeral. So the Tyneside rowers are amazing characters, and I definitely suggest you look into their story as well. So right here we have the Gateshead Millennium Bridge, and I love the story behind this, because at the turn of the millennium, what happened was that Gateshead approached Newcastle and said, we want to build a brand new bridge. Newcastle said, fantastic, what are you going to do? And they said, well, this is going to be the Newcastle Gateshead Millennium Bridge. It's going to be a turning bridge, and it turns like this and moves up like this. No doubt you'll have seen images of when the bridge turns. And it's an absolutely fantastic piece of construction, because it only takes 7.5 kilowatts of energy to turn the bridge, which is the same as boiling a kettle. They talked about all of the different parts of the bridge and how it all fitted together, and how it was going to connect Newcastle and Gateshead as another footbridge across the River Tyne. Newcastle Council turned around and said, love it, we love the idea, great. And Gateshead Council said, right, well, could we have some money to build it? Newcastle Council turned around and said, no, you're going to build it, and it's going to be called the Newcastle Gateshead Millennium Bridge. At that, Gateshead turned to the engineers and architects and said, we want you to design this bridge so it never touches the Newcastle Bank. So because of that, the Gateshead Millennium Bridge is built into the Gateshead quayside, comes over and into an island, which I nearly stood upon, then has a ramp coming over, and then there's a 3mm gap. The Gateshead Millennium Bridge never touches Newcastle, and that just shows you the rivalry between both sides even to this day. One of the things I really hope that you've got from this tour is that I've been able to show you some of the neurodiverse people of the city, tell you some of the stories, and show you parts of the city that maybe you haven't seen before or heard about previously. I really hope you're having a lovely, safe time at home, and that we'll be able to meet again in the future and tell you more of the stories of this city. But until then, just continue doing what you're doing, and thank you so much for letting me share with you these amazing stories of these amazing people of this amazing region. So look forward to seeing you in the future, and my name's Alex Iles and I run Iles Tours.